Königsberg, East Prussia, 1781. A small, quiet man of 57 years publishes a book that will shake the foundations of Western thought. The critique of pure reason hits like a bomb in the world of European philosophy, and nothing will ever be the same. Immanuel Kant spent his entire life in this remote city on the Baltic Sea, never traveling more than 100 miles from where he was born. His neighbors actually set their clocks by watching him take his daily afternoon walk. His routine was so regular, so predictable, that people joked someone must wind him up like a clock every morning. Yet from this quiet, ordered life came ideas that would change how humanity understands knowledge, right and wrong, beauty, and the very meaning of freedom. What drives a man who never saw the world to completely remake how the world thinks? What pushes someone so disciplined, so methodical, to question everything we thought was certain? The answer lies in a single moment. The day Kant read David Hume and felt his entire understanding of reality crumble. Hume, a brilliant Scottish thinker, had proven with cold logic that human knowledge rests on nothing solid. We cannot prove that one thing causes another. We cannot be sure the sun will rise tomorrow just because it rose today. Everything we call knowledge is really just habit and psychological conditioning pretending to be truth. If Hume was right, then science was impossible, morality was just opinion, and human reason was powerless. Kant later wrote that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. But this was not a gentle awakening. This was being shaken from comfortable certainty into free fall. Everything he had been taught, everything he had built his career on, everything that seemed obvious and self-evident, suddenly revealed itself as assumptions built on more assumptions with nothing underneath. Most thinkers would have given up in despair. Kant saw opportunity. If the old philosophy was broken, he would build a new one. If reason itself was in question, he would put reason on trial and force it to defend itself. He would perform what he called a revolution in philosophy, flipping the entire enterprise upside down to discover how knowledge was even possible. But this was about far more than abstract theories. At stake was human freedom itself, our ability to make real choices, to be morally responsible, to be truly free. If we are just machines responding to forces beyond our control, if our choices are already determined by natural laws, if reason cannot guide our actions, then what are we? How can we be held responsible for what we do? How can morality exist at all? Kant's answer would create an entirely new foundation for human dignity, one that placed freedom at the absolute center. We are not just objects in nature, controlled by mechanical laws. We are also subjects, thinking beings capable of making our own moral rules, capable of acting from duty rather than just following our desires. This self-rule, this ability to give ourselves the law through reason, is what makes us human. It is the source of all moral value, the foundation of all rights, the basis for political freedom and lasting peace between nations. Today, we will follow Kant's revolutionary journey through three parts: the awakening, where Kant discovers the limits of pure reason and figures out how knowledge works; the foundation, where he builds his moral philosophy based on freedom and the idea that we should only act in ways we could want everyone to act; and the vision, where he applies his insights to beauty, politics, and the dream of ending war forever. This is the story of how one man, through the sheer force of careful thinking, established the philosophical foundations for the modern world. This is the philosophy that shaped human rights, democracy, the dignity of every individual, and the possibility of global peace. The Clockwork Mind. This is Kant. Born on April 22, 1724, in Königsberg, East Prussia, Immanuel Kant entered a world of strict order and deep religious faith. His father made horse harnesses for a living. His mother belonged to a religious movement called Pietism, which emphasized personal faith and strict moral discipline. The family was not wealthy, but they valued education with an intensity that would shape everything about Kant's life. At age 8, Kant went to a Pietist school, where he later said the education was harsh and punishing, focused mostly on Latin and religious teachings. The Pietist emphasis on duty, humility, and examining yourself deeply left a permanent mark. Though he would later criticize organized religion, the moral seriousness he learned never left him. In 1740, at 16, Kant enrolled at the University of Königsberg, initially to study theology, but he quickly became fascinated by mathematics, physics, and philosophy. Here he encountered two different worlds of thought: the rationalist tradition that said pure reason alone could discover truth, and the empiricist tradition that insisted all knowledge comes from the senses and experience. When his father died in 1746, Kant had to leave university. He spent 9 years as a private tutor for wealthy families, using his free time to continue studying and begin publishing. In 1755, he published a paper proposing that the solar system formed through gravity pulling atoms together, an idea that anticipated later theories about how planets form. That same year, he received his doctorate and became a lecturer who was paid directly by students. For the next 15 years, he taught up to 28 hours per week on logic, metaphysics, mathematics, geography, and the study of human nature. He became known as a brilliant, engaging teacher whose lectures were so popular that students had to arrive an hour early to get seats. His personal life fell into strict patterns. People who knew him said neighbors literally set their clocks by watching his daily walks, so regular and precise were his habits. He thought about marriage twice but waited too long both times and never married. Yet he had an active social life, regularly hosting dinner parties where he was known for lively conversation. Only in his philosophical work did the passion beneath his ordered exterior show itself. In 1770, at age 46, Kant finally secured a permanent professorship in logic and metaphysics at the University of Königsberg. He had made it, but instead of settling into comfortable academic life, he fell silent. For 11 years, he published almost nothing, wrestling privately with problems that would transform philosophy forever. The crisis of reason. The silence hid an earthquake. Kant had read David Hume's philosophy, and it had destroyed his certainty. Hume's arguments were simple and devastating. Think about cause and effect, the foundation of all scientific knowledge. We say fire causes smoke, that striking a match causes it to light. But what do we actually see? We see one event followed by another. We see them happen together repeatedly. But we never actually see the causing itself. We cannot perceive the necessary connection between cause and effect. We only observe regularity, and from watching things happen the same way over and over, we develop the habit of expecting one thing to follow another. But habit is not knowledge. Custom is not proof. If all our beliefs about cause and effect rest on nothing more than psychological conditioning, then science has no real foundation. We cannot justify predicting the future based on the past. We cannot claim that natural laws must be true. We can only say that so far, in our limited experience, things have happened this way. The implications were catastrophic. If Hume was right, then human knowledge extended no further than immediate sense impressions and the habits we build from repeated experience. Deep questions about reality were impossible to answer. Religious beliefs were groundless. Even basic scientific claims could not be rationally justified. Kant saw the danger immediately. If Hume's skepticism was accepted, all of human learning would be reduced to mere opinion and habit. The Enlightenment project, the attempt to build society on reason rather than tradition or authority, would collapse. The emerging scientific worldview would have no philosophical foundation. But Kant also sensed opportunity. If the problem was this fundamental, then solving it would require rebuilding philosophy from scratch. The old approach, which assumed reason could discover truth about reality through pure thought alone, was clearly broken. But Hume's radical approach, which reduced everything to sense experience and psychological association, was equally wrong. There had to be a middle way. There had to be a framework that could explain both why mathematical and scientific knowledge seems necessary and certain, while also being based on experience. Kant saw that the question was not, can we have knowledge? We clearly do. Mathematics works. Physics makes predictions that come true. The question was, how is knowledge even possible? This question would occupy him for the next decade, as he worked alone on what would become the Critique of Pure Reason. When it finally appeared in 1781, the book was massive, difficult, and written in a new philosophical vocabulary that readers found almost impossible to understand at first. Initial reviews were confused and dismissive, but gradually as people worked through its arguments, they began to realize they were witnessing a revolution. The Copernican Revolution. Kant compared his breakthrough to what Nicholas Copernicus did in astronomy. Just as Copernicus solved problems by proposing that Earth moves around the Sun rather than the Sun around Earth, Kant proposed reversing the relationship between mind and world. Traditional philosophy assumed that our knowledge must match up with objects, that our minds must somehow reach out and grasp reality as it truly is. But what if we reverse this? What if objects must match up with the structure of our minds, with the way our thinking necessarily organizes experience? Think about space and time. We experience everything as located in space and occurring in time. But are space and time features of reality itself, or are they features of how we necessarily experience reality? Kant argued for the second option. Space and time are not things themselves or properties of things. They are pure forms of how the human mind structures all sensory experience. This was radical. It meant that when we perceive the world, we are not seeing reality as it truly is in itself. We are seeing reality as it appears to beings with our particular mental structure. Kant made a crucial distinction. Phenomena are the world as it appears to us through our mental framework, while noumena are things as they are in themselves, independent of our perception. We can only know phenomena, the world of appearance. The noumenal realm, reality in itself, remains forever beyond human knowledge. We can think about things in themselves. We can acknowledge they must exist, but we can never know them. This distinction solved numerous philosophical problems at once. It explained how mathematical knowledge could be both necessary and universal, while also being informative and useful. Geometry is necessarily true because space is the form of how we experience the outer world. Mathematical truths are truths about how we must experience the world, not about some abstract realm of numbers. It explained how causation could be both necessary and based on experience. Causality is not a feature we observe in nature, but a category our mind imposes on experience. We cannot experience events except as causally ordered because causal ordering is part of how our understanding structures experience. This is what Kant meant by his revolution in thinking. Instead of assuming the mind passively receives information from an independent reality, we recognize that the mind actively structures experience according to its own forms and categories. We can have knowledge that is independent of specific experiences precisely because that knowledge reflects the necessary structure of how we experience, not features of things as they exist independently of us. But this revolution came at a cost. If we can only know phenomena, then traditional attempts to know reality in itself are impossible. We cannot prove God exists through pure reason. We cannot demonstrate the soul is immortal. We cannot establish that we have free will. These questions go beyond the limits of possible experience, and therefore beyond the limits of human knowledge. Kant argued that previous philosophy had failed precisely because it tried to apply our categories of understanding beyond their proper domain. Understanding and reason can only legitimately be applied to things as they appear to us in experience. What things are in themselves independent of our minds remains beyond what can be known. Does this mean we must abandon God, immortality, and freedom? Not at all. It means we must recognize these are not objects of theoretical knowledge, but beliefs we must accept based on practical reason. Beliefs necessary not because we can prove them, but because they are required for morality itself. This opened the door to the second half of Kant's philosophical system. If theoretical reason has limits, what about practical reason? Reason as it guides action. Here Kant would build his moral philosophy, based not on trying to know reality in itself, but on the nature of practical rationality itself. The moral law within. Kant believed that the fundamental principle of morality is what he called a categorical imperative, a command that applies to all thinking beings unconditionally, not because it helps us get what we want, but simply because we are rational beings capable of acting according to principle. To understand this, we need to distinguish two kinds of commands. Hypothetical imperatives are conditional. If you want X, then do Y. If you want to be healthy, exercise. If you want to pass the exam, study. These commands only bind us if we have the relevant desires or goals. We can escape them by giving up the goal. But moral requirements are not like this. They bind us regardless of what we want or desire. The categorical imperative is unconditional. It applies simply because we are rational agents, not because of any particular ends we happen to have. What could such a command say? Since it cannot depend on any particular goals or desires, it can only command following universal law itself. Kant's first version of the categorical imperative states, "Act only according to that principle, which you could at the same time will to become a universal law." This principle is simple but profound. Before acting, ask yourself, could I rationally want everyone to act on this principle? If not, the action is morally wrong. Think about lying. Can you will that everyone lies whenever it is convenient? No, because if everyone lied, the whole system of promising and truth-telling would collapse. No one would believe anything anyone said. The very act of lying requires assuming that people generally tell the truth. Otherwise, deception would be impossible. So lying fails the test of being something you could universally will. This is not merely about consequences. The point is not that universal lying would be unpleasant or lead to bad results. The point is that willing universal lying involves a contradiction. You are simultaneously relying on truth-telling while undermining it. A rational will cannot consistently will its own destruction. Kant gave several other versions of the categorical imperative, each highlighting different aspects of moral thinking. The formula of humanity states, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, always at the same time as an end and never merely as a means. This version captures what is perhaps most distinctive about Kant's ethics. Human beings have absolute worth, dignity, precisely because they are rational agents capable of self-determination, capable of acting according to principles they give themselves. To treat someone merely as a means is to deny their rational agency, to manipulate them as if they were objects rather than self-determining subjects. But why is rational agency valuable? Here Kant's answer is radical. The ultimate source of all value is human freedom, the capacity to act according to principles of reason, rather than being controlled by natural forces or desire. Rationality is valuable because it is the means to freedom. The paradox of freedom. This brings us to perhaps the deepest problem in Kant's philosophy, the apparent conflict between moral freedom and natural cause and effect. Science describes a world where every event is caused by prior events. If humans are part of nature, subject to the same causal laws, how can we be free? And if we are not free, how can we be morally responsible? Kant's solution relies on his distinction between phenomena and noumena. As things in the natural world that we study scientifically, our actions are indeed subject to cause and effect. But as things in themselves beyond the realm of possible experience, we may possess a different kind of causality, the causality of freedom. When we think about what to do, when we weigh reasons and make choices, we cannot help but think of ourselves as free. The standpoint of practical reason requires that we operate under the idea of freedom. We must assume our freedom as a condition of making moral judgments and engaging in deliberation about what to do. But this freedom is not something we can prove through theoretical reason. It is something we must assume based on practical reason, something we must believe as a condition for morality itself. We cannot know that we are free in the way we know scientific facts, but we have the strongest possible practical grounds for believing in freedom. Without it, moral obligation makes no sense. This is the distinctive character of what Kant calls autonomy. Autonomy is the property of the will by which it is a law to itself. A free will and a will under moral law are the same thing. When we act morally, we are not submitting to external rules. We are following principles we ourselves have created through our own practical reason. Though the moral law binds all rational agents universally, we impose it on ourselves. We autonomously prescribe the moral law to ourselves. This is freedom in its deepest sense, not the absence of law, but self-legislation, not doing whatever we want, but giving ourselves the law through reason. The paradox dissolves. Freedom and moral law are not opposed. Freedom is not the ability to choose randomly or act on impulse. True freedom is the ability to determine yourself according to rational principles, to act from duty rather than mere inclination. When you act morally, you are most fully yourself, most fully a rational agent, most fully free. This conception of freedom had revolutionary implications. If all rational beings are autonomous, if all possess this dignity of self-legislation, then all deserve respect. Human beings have intrinsic value, not because they serve some external purpose, but simply because they are ends in themselves. This became the philosophical foundation for human rights, for the idea that there are limits on what can be done to individuals, even to achieve social goals. Duty and inclination. But Kant's ethics faces an immediate objection. If morality is about acting from duty rather than inclination, does this mean that helping others from love or compassion has no moral worth? Does virtue require coldness, doing good reluctantly? Kant's actual view is more subtle than critics often acknowledge. An action has moral worth not when it opposes inclination, but when it is motivated by recognition of duty. Acting from duty does not require acting reluctantly. You can take pleasure in helping others, feel warm affection and compassion, and still be acting from duty if your action would remain the same, even if those feelings were absent. The point is that moral worth comes from recognizing that this is what morality requires, not from whatever other motivations might be present. Kant never said that inclination is bad, or that we should eliminate our natural feelings and desires. He said only that morality cannot be based on inclination, because feelings are variable, particular, and unpredictable. If morality were based on feeling, it would have no stability, no universality. Some people naturally feel compassion, others do not. Some feel moved to help in some situations, but not others. But moral requirements must be universal and necessary. They must apply to all rational agents regardless of their particular feelings or circumstances. Moreover, basing morality on feeling would undermine moral responsibility. If you help someone only because you feel like it, you deserve no more credit than if you happened to sneeze when someone needed a tissue. Moral worth comes from recognizing that reason requires this action, from choosing to do what duty demands because duty demands it. This is not a cold, unfeeling ethics. It is an ethics that respects the rational agency of moral actors. You are acting morally when you recognize the force of moral reasons and allow them to determine your will, regardless of what your inclinations might be pushing you toward. Kant distinguished between perfect duties, which must be fulfilled always and without exception, and imperfect duties, which leave some room for deciding when and how to fulfill them. We have a perfect duty not to lie, not to make false promises, not to harm others. But we have an imperfect duty to develop our talents and help others in need, duties that allow discretion about how to fulfill them. The categorical imperative generates duties in both categories. Some principles cannot be universalized without contradiction, and these give rise to perfect duties. Other principles could be universalized but cannot be rationally willed, and these give rise to imperfect duties. Together, they form a complete system of moral requirements based entirely on practical reason itself. The kingdom of ends. Kant's third version of the categorical imperative imagines a kingdom of ends, a systematic union of rational beings under common objective laws. Every rational being must act as if he were through his principles always a law-making member in this universal kingdom. This version brings together all the elements of Kant's ethics into a unified vision. Imagine a community where everyone acts only on principles that could serve as universal law, where everyone treats everyone else as an end, rather than merely as a means. This would be a community of mutual respect, where each person's autonomy is recognized and honored by all. Such a community is the ideal toward which moral action aims. The kingdom of ends would be a system of freedom, in which all agents freely pursue their freely chosen ends, to the extent compatible with like freedom for all. It represents not a utopian fantasy, but the logical implication of treating all rational beings as having equal moral worth. This ideal has profound political implications. If all rational beings are autonomous legislators in the kingdom of ends, then legitimate political authority must respect this autonomy. Government cannot treat citizens as mere subjects to be manipulated for state purposes. Every rational being has a right to freedom, and civil society exists to realize and preserve that freedom through law. Kant's moral philosophy thus provides the foundation for his political thought. If autonomy is the supreme value, if all rational beings possess equal dignity, then political institutions must be structured to protect and promote this autonomy for all citizens. The moral law points towards specific forms of political organization, specific conceptions of rights and justice. But before exploring Kant's political vision, we must complete the critical system by examining his theory of beauty, where he seeks to bridge the gap between the realm of nature, governed by causal necessity, and the realm of freedom, governed by moral law. The beautiful and the sublime. In 1790, Kant published The Critique of Judgment, the third and final major work that completed his critical philosophy. The book deals with judgments about beauty, particularly of the beautiful and the sublime, and with how we understand nature as if it were designed with purposes in mind. Why would Kant, after figuring out how knowledge works and how morality is grounded, turn to beauty? Because a gap remained in his system. Science describes a mechanical, cause and effect natural world. Morality requires freedom and self-determination. These two realms seem completely separate, even contradictory. Experience of beauty offers a bridge between them. A judgment about beauty is based on feeling, specifically on pleasure or displeasure. Kant distinguishes three types: judgments of the agreeable, which are purely personal preferences; judgments of beauty, which claim universal validity despite being based on feeling; and judgments of the sublime. Judgments of beauty differ from judgments of the agreeable because they are disinterested. We do not seek to possess beautiful objects or use them for any purpose. We simply contemplate them with pleasure. This disinterested pleasure is what makes aesthetic experience different from merely finding something pleasant or useful. Moreover, when we judge something beautiful, we are not merely reporting our personal preference. We are claiming that others ought to agree, that there is something in the object that warrants this response. Yet this universality is not based on concepts or rules. I cannot prove something is beautiful by definition or argument. The judgment that something is beautiful is a claim that it has what Kant calls the form of purposiveness, that it appears designed with a purpose, even though it has no obvious practical function. A beautiful object displays a kind of purposiveness without purpose, an organization that seems intentional without serving any definite end. This is what creates the distinctive pleasure of beauty. In looking at something beautiful, imagination and understanding engage in free play. The imagination produces various forms, and the understanding finds harmonious order in them without forcing them under specific concepts. The mental faculties work together freely, and this harmony is experienced as pleasure. The sublime differs fundamentally from the beautiful. While beauty presents harmonious form, the sublime confronts us with the formless, the boundless, the overwhelming. Vast deserts, towering mountains, the ocean in a storm, the night sky filled with stars. These inspire not the calm pleasure of beauty but a mixture of awe and fear. When confronted with the mathematically sublime, something so vast we cannot take it all in, our imagination fails to grasp it. But this failure reveals something higher, our reason, which can think totalities that exceed all possible experience. Similarly, the dynamically sublime confronts us with overwhelming power, reminding us of our physical vulnerability while revealing our moral capacity to resist and transcend merely natural forces. The experience of the sublime thus connects the sensible world to what lies beyond it. Both beauty and the sublime support moral awareness by pointing beyond the merely physical world toward something transcendent, toward the realm of freedom and rational agency. Genius in art. Kant also developed a theory of genius, the creative capacity that produces great art. Genius, he argued, has its own rules that cannot be taught or learned by studying examples. The genius creates original works that establish new standards rather than following existing ones. This might seem paradoxical. If genius operates by its own rules, how can its products be judged? How do we distinguish genuine genius from mere weirdness? Kant's answer is that genius must still operate within the constraints of aesthetic judgment itself, The work must be beautiful, must exhibit purposive form, must engage our mental faculties in harmonious free play. The beautiful serves as a symbol for morality. The form of purposiveness in beautiful objects mirrors the form of rational willing in moral action. Both involve purposiveness, harmony, and the coordination of faculties or principles toward an end. In appreciating beauty, we exercise the same capacities of judgment that we employ in moral thinking, just without the pressure of practical action. This explains why cultivating taste matters. By developing our capacity for aesthetic judgment, by learning to appreciate beauty and be moved by the sublime, we develop the same capacities necessary for moral judgment. We become more sensitive to harmony, more capable of sustained reflection, more open to being moved by considerations that transcend immediate self-interest. The critique of judgment thus completes Kant's critical project by showing how the realms of nature and freedom, while remaining distinct, can be connected through aesthetic and purposive judgment. We can understand nature as if it were designed with purposes without giving up mechanical explanation. We can experience beauty and sublimity in ways that point toward moral awareness without reducing morality to feeling. The political order of freedom. Kant's political philosophy flows directly from his moral theory. If every rational being has a right to freedom, then civil society exists to protect and realize that freedom under law. The state is not justified by divine right, tradition, or mere power to command. It is justified only to the extent that it secures the conditions under which each person's freedom is compatible with the freedom of all others. Kant favored what he called a republican constitution, which he defined as having representative government with separation of legislative and executive powers. This was not democracy in the direct sense, which he worried could become tyrannical, but a system where laws are made by representatives accountable to citizens and executed by distinct authorities. The key principle is that any action is right if it can coexist with everyone's freedom according to a universal law. Just as moral actions must be universalizable, so must laws. A legitimate legal system is one that could be accepted by all rational citizens as consistent with their equal freedom. This commits Kant to fundamental rights. Citizens must have civil liberty, the freedom to pursue happiness in their own way, as long as they respect others' equal freedom. They must have legal equality, equal standing before the law regardless of birth or status. They must have political independence, the right to participate as equal members in the process that creates the laws binding them. But Kant was no revolutionary. He insisted that bringing existing states closer to the republican ideal must be a gradual process of reform from within the system, not violent overthrow. Even unjust governments must be obeyed, and citizens have no right of revolution. This may seem inconsistent with his commitment to freedom and autonomy, but Kant worried that revolution would throw society into chaos and likely produce even worse tyranny. The path to justice lies through enlightenment. As citizens become more educated, more capable of thinking for themselves, more aware of their rights, they will press for reform. Rulers, even those not elected, will recognize that freer citizens are more productive and make the state stronger. The incentive structure itself pushes toward greater freedom, though progress may be slow and uneven. Perpetual peace. In 1795, Kant published Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch, which outlined his vision for ending war and establishing lasting peace among nations. The essay is structured like a peace treaty, with initial articles describing immediate steps and definitive articles establishing permanent conditions for peace. The initial articles include banning secret treaties that reserve grounds for future war, prohibiting the takeover of states, abolishing standing armies, refusing to take on national debts for foreign adventures, forbidding interference in other states' internal affairs, and limiting conduct in war to avoid acts that would make future peace impossible. These are negative constraints, rules prohibiting actions that keep the cycle of war going. But permanent peace requires positive institutions. Kant's 3 definitive articles call for every state to have a republican constitution, for nations to form a federation of free states rather than a world government, and for universal hospitality, allowing individuals to travel and trade across borders. Why would republican constitutions promote peace? Because in a republic, citizens bear the costs of war directly. If the consent of citizens is required to declare war, they will be extremely careful about undertaking it, knowing they must fight, pay for it from their own resources, and bear the devastation it leaves behind. Rulers who do not answer to citizens can declare war on a whim because they do not personally bear these costs. But in a republic, those who decide about war are the same people who will suffer its consequences. This creates a powerful incentive for peace. Self-interest itself, properly channeled through republican institutions, can achieve what morality commands. The Federation of Free States provides a framework for resolving disputes without war. Not a world government, which Kant feared would become tyrannical, but a voluntary association of independent republics committed to settling conflicts through negotiation and law. Universal hospitality, the right to visit foreign lands and engage in peaceful commerce without hostility, creates economic connections between peoples. As nations trade and interact, they develop shared interests. War becomes economically irrational because it disrupts the networks of exchange that benefit all parties. Kant recognized that perpetual peace would not come from moral transformation alone. Most people and most states act primarily from self-interest, not pure moral principle. But properly designed institutions can channel self-interest toward peace. Republican constitutions, international federations, and commercial exchange create conditions where peace serves everyone's interests better than war. This is Kant's great insight about politics. We do not need a nation of angels to achieve peace and justice. We need institutions that make cooperation rational even for people motivated by self-interest, as long as they have understanding. Well-designed political structures can produce good outcomes even when individual actors are not particularly moral. Yet Kant insisted this is not merely cold calculation. Perpetual peace is a moral duty, something we are obligated to work toward regardless of whether it seems achievable. Even if we cannot guarantee success, we must act as if peace is possible and take steps toward it. This is what practical reason demands. The vision was revolutionary for its time and remains radical today. Kant imagined a world where democratic nations, bound together by law and economic exchange, would make war obsolete. He envisioned the gradual expansion of republican government, the strengthening of international law, the growth of cosmopolitan consciousness that sees all humans as fellow citizens in a global community. History has partially proved this vision right. Democratic nations rarely go to war with each other. International institutions, however imperfect, provide frameworks for cooperation. The expansion of trade has created incentives for peace, yet war persists, nationalism remains powerful, and the dream of perpetual peace remains unfulfilled. Kant would not be surprised. He understood that progress is neither guaranteed nor straightforward, but he insisted we have a duty to work toward peace, to strengthen institutions that make cooperation possible, to expand the circle of those we recognize as deserving equal respect and rights. The religion within. In Religion Within the Bounds of Mere Reason, published in 1793, Kant addressed the relationship between morality and religion. His central claim was that rational morality is independent of religious belief, though religion can support moral motivation and provide hope that the moral life will ultimately be rewarded. Kant distinguished between what religion can teach us and what pure practical reason can establish on its own. Morality does not need religion. The categorical imperative, the recognition of duty, the respect for rational agency, all of these can be grasped through reason alone. We do not need divine commands to know that lying, murder, and exploitation are wrong. But religion addresses questions that pure reason cannot answer. Will virtue ultimately be rewarded? Is there justice beyond this life? Can we hope that the moral order of the universe will prevail? These questions go beyond what can be known, but they matter deeply for sustaining moral commitment. Kant argued that we must believe in three things as conditions for the possibility of morality: freedom, the immortality of the soul, and the existence of God. Not because we can prove these theoretically, but because they are necessary assumptions of practical reason. We must believe in freedom because moral obligation makes no sense without it. We must believe in immortality because complete virtue, the perfect alignment of will with moral law, requires infinite progress beyond what is possible in finite life. We must believe in God because only God can guarantee that virtue and happiness, which often come apart in this world, will ultimately be united in proportion to moral worth. These are rational beliefs, based not on revelation or mystical experience, but on the requirements of practical reason itself. Religion, properly understood, is recognizing moral duties as if they were divine commands. Not that God randomly commands certain things and thereby makes them moral. Rather, what morality requires through reason is what God, as the perfect moral being, necessarily wills. Kant's approach was deeply threatening to traditional theology. He rejected the idea that revelation could add real content to morality beyond what reason already teaches. He dismissed prayers asking for things, sacraments, and rituals as having no moral value in themselves. What matters is moral action, and this can be fully understood and practiced without religious observance. Many religious authorities condemned Kant's views as hidden atheism. The Prussian government pressured him to stop writing on religious topics, a command he obeyed by promising not to publish on religion during the king's lifetime. Yet Kant saw himself as providing religion its true foundation, purifying it of superstition, and grounding it in the moral law. The religious dimension of Kant's thought is often overlooked, but it reveals something essential. His philosophy is not coldly rationalist or dismissive of the deeper human need for meaning and hope. It recognizes that practical reason, while fully capable of determining our duties, also raises questions it cannot fully answer. We can act morally without knowing whether the universe is ultimately just. But we can reasonably hope that it is, and that hope can sustain moral commitment in the face of suffering and injustice. Enlightenment. Dare to know. In 1784, Kant published a short essay titled, "What is Enlightenment?" that has become one of his most quoted works. The essay addressed a question posed by a journal. What exactly is this movement called enlightenment that everyone talks about? Kant's answer was direct. Enlightenment is when people emerge from immaturity that they brought on themselves. Immaturity is the inability to use your own understanding without someone else guiding you. The motto of enlightenment is simple: Saper aude, dare to know. Have courage to use your own understanding. This was not a call to reject all authority or tradition. It was a call to think for yourself, to question, to demand reasons, to refuse to accept claims simply because they come from powerful sources or ancient texts. Maturity means taking responsibility for your own beliefs, examining them critically, changing them when evidence and argument demand it. Why do people remain immature? Partly from laziness and fear. It is comfortable to let others think for you, to follow rules without question, to accept what you are told. Thinking for yourself is difficult, uncertain, sometimes dangerous. But this very difficulty is what makes enlightenment valuable and necessary. More troubling, those in power actively work to keep people immature. Leaders who have taken it upon themselves to supervise others are happy to present independent thinking as dangerous. If you question authority, they warn, social order will collapse. Better to remain safely within established boundaries, following the guidance of those who supposedly know better. Kant made a distinction between what he called private and public use of reason. The private use means reason used in one's official job or role. A soldier following orders, a tax official applying regulations, a minister delivering church doctrine from the pulpit. These involve private use of reason. Here, obedience may be required for institutions to function. But the public use of reason, the use one makes as a scholar addressing the educated public through writing and speech, must always be free. The same minister who obeys church doctrine in the pulpit must be free to publish scholarly criticisms of that doctrine. The same official who enforces tax law must be free to argue publicly that the law should be changed. This distinction allowed Kant to argue for intellectual freedom, even within hierarchical institutions. You can obey while also critiquing, fulfill your role while also questioning whether that role should be structured differently. Progress happens when private citizens, in their public capacity as scholars and writers, freely examine and criticize existing arrangements. The essay was both describing what was already happening and arguing for what should continue. Kant described the process of enlightenment that was already underway in Europe, the growing confidence in reason, the weakening of traditional authorities, the spread of education, and critical thinking. But he also argued that this process must continue, must be protected, must be extended to all areas of life. A ruler who encourages enlightenment among his subjects, who allows free public discussion and criticism, ultimately strengthens his state. Enlightened citizens are more productive, more innovative, more loyal because they understand and accept the reasons for laws rather than merely submitting to force. Even from pure self-interest, rulers should promote enlightenment. Yet Kant recognized the paradox. Enlightenment requires conditions that the unenlightened may not grant. How can you convince people who reject reason to embrace it? How can you persuade authorities who benefit from ignorance to allow free thought? There is no guaranteed path, only the hope that as more individuals dare to think for themselves, the momentum becomes unstoppable. The essay captures something essential about Kant's entire project. His philosophy is not merely an academic exercise, but a practical intervention aimed at human liberation. By demonstrating the power and limits of reason, by grounding morality in autonomy, by showing how freedom can be realized through law, Kant provided intellectual tools for emancipation, the legacy of critical philosophy. Immanuel Kant died on February 12, 1804, in Königsberg, the city he never left. His last words were reportedly, "Es ist gut," it is good. He was buried with honors, and thousands attended his funeral. Within decades, his philosophy had become the foundation for virtually all later German philosophy and had spread throughout Europe and beyond. The impact is difficult to overstate. Kant set the terms for philosophical debate that persist to this day. After Kant, no serious philosopher could ignore the questions he raised. How is knowledge possible? What are the limits of reason? What grounds morality? What is freedom? How can we be both natural beings subject to cause and effect and moral agents capable of self-determination? His immediate successors, the German idealists, tried to overcome what they saw as Kant's split between phenomena and noumena, between the natural world and the realm of freedom. Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel each developed ambitious systems that sought to unify what Kant had separated. Yet they did so using Kantian concepts and addressing Kantian problems. Even those who rejected Kant's conclusions accepted his framework. Schopenhauer built his pessimistic philosophy on Kantian foundations, while claiming Kant had not pushed his insights far enough. Nietzsche attacked Kant's moral philosophy viciously, but absorbed the critical method and the distinction between appearance and reality. In the 20th century, Kant's influence continued through multiple channels. The logical positivists and analytic philosophers engaged deeply with his theory of knowledge, even when rejecting parts of it. John Rawls grounded his theory of justice in Kantian autonomy and the categorical imperative. Jürgen Habermas built his ethics on Kantian principles of universalizability and respect for persons. Continental philosophy likewise remained in dialogue with Kant. Phenomenology, from Edmund Husserl through Martin Heidegger to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, wrestled with Kantian questions about the structure of experience and the relation between mind and world. Postmodern thinkers, from Michel Foucault to Jacques Derrida, defined themselves partly through engagement with and rejection of Kantian themes. Beyond academic philosophy, Kant's ideas shaped the modern world in concrete ways. His moral philosophy provided foundations for human rights, for the idea that there are universal principles that limit what can be done to individuals. His political thought influenced how democracies are designed, democratic theory, and the development of international law. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, embodies Kantian principles that all humans possess inherent dignity, that this dignity imposes limits on state power, that political legitimacy depends on respecting individual autonomy. The European Union structure, with its commitment to democracy, human rights, and peaceful cooperation, reflects Kant's vision of a federation of free states. Even in practical debates about right and wrong, Kant's influence persists. When we argue whether it is okay to lie to save a life, whether the ends can justify the means, whether there are absolute moral rules, we are engaging Kantian themes. When we insist on treating people as ends rather than merely as means, we invoke Kantian principles, even if we do not realize it. Yet Kant's legacy is contested. Critics argue that his ethics is too rigid, too abstract, too disconnected from human psychology and social context. Can morality really be reduced to the categorical imperative? Does the categorical imperative actually tell us what to do in specific situations, or can it be interpreted in multiple ways? Is the formula of humanity genuinely different from just trying to produce good consequences in practice? Feminist philosophers have argued that Kant's emphasis on reason and autonomy reflects masculine bias and neglects the moral importance of care, relationship, and emotional connection. Communitarian critics charge that Kant's focus on individual autonomy ignores how deeply we are shaped by communities and traditions. Some worry that Kant's distinction between persons and things, his insistence that only rational beings have moral status, provides too narrow a foundation for environmental ethics. If moral status depends on rationality, what about animals, ecosystems, future generations? Can Kantian ethics adequately address the moral challenges of our relationship with the natural world? These are serious challenges that followers of Kant continue to address. Some argue that Kant's principles, properly understood, have more flexibility than critics recognize. Others develop new approaches inspired by Kant that preserve core insights while modifying problematic elements. Still others defend Kant's original positions while acknowledging they may conflict with common moral intuitions. What cannot be denied is that Kant changed philosophy permanently. He demonstrated that the most abstract theoretical questions have profound practical implications. He showed that taking human autonomy seriously requires rethinking not just ethics, but how we know things, what reality is, politics, beauty, and religion. He proved that rigorous philosophical analysis can be revolutionary, can challenge existing power structures, can provide resources for human emancipation. The man behind the system. The philosophical system is so imposing that we can forget the human being who created it. Who was Kant? Contemporary accounts describe someone who does not quite fit the stereotype of the cold rationalist his philosophy might suggest. He was slight in build, barely 5 feet tall, with a weak constitution that made him careful about his health. He followed strict routines partly from necessity, believing careful regulation kept him alive. Yet he was also known for his dinner parties, his lively conversation, his wit and humor. He reportedly had a good singing voice and enjoyed company, though he insisted that dinner should never include philosophical discussion. Students found him an engaging lecturer who brought even the driest subjects to life with examples and stories. He was generous with his time, meeting with students privately, writing letters of recommendation, helping with career placement. He contributed quietly to charitable causes and helped support relatives in need. Yet there was something remote about him, a part held back from ordinary human connection. He never married, never traveled, never experienced much that lies outside the life of the mind. He seemed to live more intensely in his thoughts than in the world, as if external reality was less real than the realm of concepts and arguments. The contrast between the order of his external life and the revolution brewing in his thought is striking. While maintaining the most conventional, predictable existence imaginable, he was systematically tearing down and rebuilding the foundations of human knowledge and morality. The clockwork routine provided stable ground for intellectual adventures that might otherwise have been overwhelming. Perhaps this is what made the achievement possible. Kant could venture into the depths of philosophical questioning because his external world remained secure and structured. He could question everything because his daily life questioned nothing. The rigidity of routine freed his mind for unlimited inquiry. Or perhaps the routine itself reflected the personality that drove the philosophy, a deep need for order, structure, system. Kant could not rest until he had organized all of human knowledge into a coherent framework, until every question had its place, every principle its foundation. The three critiques form a complete whole, each supporting the others. together encompassing the entirety of human experience, from knowledge to action to aesthetic feeling. This drive for completeness, for systematic unity, is both Kant's greatest strength and a potential weakness. The system has tremendous explanatory power and internal coherence, but it can seem rigid, overdetermined, as if reality must conform to the categories Kant has established rather than the categories emerging from reality. Yet Kant would likely accept this criticism as misunderstanding his method. He never claimed to describe reality as it truly is in itself. He claimed to describe the necessary structure of how rational beings like us must experience and think about reality. The system is not imposed arbitrarily, but discovered through reflection on the conditions that make experience and knowledge possible. This is why Kant can seem both incredibly confident and profoundly humble. Confident in claiming to have established the final framework for all possible knowledge and morality. Humble in recognizing the limits of reason, in acknowledging that reality in itself exceeds our grasp, in accepting that the deepest questions admit no theoretical answers. The unfinished project. What remains living in Kant's philosophy today? What can we still learn from someone writing over 2 centuries ago, before evolution, relativity, quantum mechanics, computers, neuroscience, all the developments that have transformed how we understand ourselves and the world? The specific content of Kant's answers may be dated. Few philosophers today accept his theory of space and time as pure forms of how we experience, now that physics describes space-time as something dynamic that can curve and flex. Few accept his specific examples of what the categorical imperative requires, now that we recognize greater moral complexity in situations he treated as straightforward. But Kant's questions remain urgent. How do we reconcile scientific cause and effect with moral responsibility? What grounds moral obligation? Can there be universal moral principles that bind all rational agents? What is the relationship between individual freedom and political authority? How can we move toward a more peaceful, just world order? These questions have not been answered definitively. Different philosophical traditions offer different responses, and the debates continue. But Kant provided tools that remain essential for thinking seriously about these issues. The distinction between is and ought, between facts and values, between what is the case and what should be the case, structures most contemporary debate about ethics. The recognition that you cannot get normative conclusions from purely descriptive premises is a Kantian insight that has become foundational. The emphasis on human autonomy, on the capacity for self-determination and self-legislation, underlies modern human rights discourse and liberal political theory. Even those who reject Kant's specific formulations often operate within a framework that takes individual autonomy as the starting point. The idea that moral principles must be universalizable, that what is right for one must be right for all in relevantly similar circumstances, provides a basic test that most people intuitively accept. We recognize special pleading, hypocrisy, self-serving exceptions as moral failures because we implicitly accept something like Kant's universalization requirement. The distinction between treating people as ends versus merely as means captures something deep about respect for persons. We recognize that manipulation, coercion, and exploitation wrong people in a distinctive way, reducing them from subjects to objects, denying their rational agency. Perhaps most importantly, Kant demonstrated that philosophy can be practical. Theoretical investigation into the nature of knowledge and reality connects directly to questions about how to live and how to organize society. Getting clear about what we can know, what we must assume, what exceeds our grasp matters for understanding our place in the world and our obligations to each other. The critical method remains valuable, examining the foundations of our beliefs, questioning what seems self-evident, distinguishing what can be known from what must be assumed, recognizing the limits of reason while defending its proper authority. In an age of dogmatism from all sides, of people convinced they possess absolute truth, Kant's combination of confidence and humility offers a model. He was confident that reason can discover truth, that morality has objective foundations, that human freedom and dignity are real and significant. But he was also humble about what reason can demonstrate. accepting that the deepest questions about reality and religion exceed theoretical knowledge, that we must act on beliefs we cannot prove. This combination seems especially needed now. We face global challenges that require both moral conviction and recognition of uncertainty. Climate change, technological disruption, inequality, threats to democracy, risks of catastrophic conflict. We need the confidence to act on moral principles while acknowledging uncertainty about complex empirical questions. We need to respect human freedom and autonomy while coordinating collective action. Kant's vision of perpetual peace through republican institutions, international law, and commercial connection remains unrealized, but not obsolete. The project he outlined, the gradual expansion of freedom under law, the strengthening of institutions that make cooperation rational, the development of cosmopolitan consciousness, this project continues. Every advance in human rights, every strengthening of democratic institutions, every expansion of international cooperation represents progress toward the world Kant imagined. Every slide into authoritarianism, nationalism, war represents failure to honor the obligations he believed reason imposes. The core of Kant's message is that we are not merely animals driven by instinct or machines controlled by causal laws. We are rational agents capable of self-determination, capable of giving ourselves law through reason, capable of respecting that same capacity in others. This autonomy is the source of human dignity and the foundation of all moral and political obligation. Whether we can live up to this vision, whether we can create institutions and practices that truly respect autonomy for all, whether we can achieve the kingdom of ends even approximately, these remain open questions. But Kant insisted we must act as if it is possible, must work toward it regardless of obstacles, must never abandon the project of becoming fully rational, fully autonomous, fully free. This is not naive optimism. Kant had no illusions about human nature, about our capacity for evil, about how far we are from moral perfection. But he believed that moral progress, though never guaranteed, is possible. That reason, though limited, is powerful. That freedom, though constantly threatened, is real. The critical philosophy is ultimately about human possibility. It asks what we can know, what we should do, what we may hope. It answers that we can know the world of experience, we should act from duty and respect for rational agency. We may hope that virtue and happiness will ultimately unite. These answers define a distinctive human condition, finite beings with unlimited rational aspirations, natural creatures capable of transcending nature through freedom, individuals who find fulfillment only in community with others. We are neither angels nor beasts, neither gods nor machines, but something unique, something that Kant believed had never been adequately understood before his critical philosophy. Whether he succeeded in that understanding, whether his system captures something essential about human existence, or reflects merely the prejudices of 18th century European culture, continues to be debated. But that the questions matter, that philosophy can illuminate the human condition, that reason applied rigorously and honestly can yield insights worth having, this Kant proved beyond doubt. In the end, Kant offers not a comfortable doctrine but a challenging ideal. Think for yourself, dare to know, respect the rational agency in yourself and others, act only on principles you can will as universal law, work toward a world where freedom and justice prevail. Simple to state, impossibly difficult to achieve, yet required by reason itself. This is the complete philosophy of Kant. A vision of human beings as autonomous rational agents, of morality grounded in freedom and self-legislation, of knowledge limited but real, of a possible world where peace and justice reign. The foundations he built remain, supporting structures we still inhabit, pointing toward possibilities we have yet to realize. The clockwork philosopher from Königsberg, who never traveled, who never varied his routine, who seemed the embodiment of order and predictability, unleashed ideas that continue to revolutionize how we think about ourselves and our world. In his quiet study, through pure thought and rigorous argument, he glimpsed what human beings could become if we dared to be fully rational, fully autonomous, fully free. That vision remains before us, unfulfilled but not impossible, distant but not unreachable. Kant showed the way. Whether we have the courage to follow is now our question to answer.